Hello everyone, my name is Ayşe. I'm a fourth year PhD student in Professor Zoltanaj's group at Purdue. Now I'm going to present one of our projects on the development of a digital twin for pharmaceutical crystallization and process optimization. Crystallization is the main particle formation and the first purification step in many industrial processes, especially in pharma. Almost all the drug compounds, which are called active pharmaceutical ingredients, are produced by crystallization processes in different modes, such as batch or continuous. This step is crucial for dictating the downstream operations and final drug properties that are strictly regulated by administrations. Based on the required product properties, which we call key attributes, generally the crystallization step is studied the first and adjusted accordingly. Various studies have demonstrated that physical properties of the particles from crystallization affect the bioavailability, operation of downstream units such as filtering and milling, or even the uniformity in tableting. To be able to control these key process parameters, it is crucial to have control and prediction power on crystallization process. Here, in the picture, you see a typical pharma process for tablet production. After the synthesis of the active ingredient, the mass production starts with crystallization, followed by further separation steps such as filtration and drying, and size and shape adjustment steps such as milling and granulation before the final product is obtained. The crystal properties that can be controlled and modified to meet key product attributes and downstream unit operation requirements are crystal size, shape, polymorph, or chirality. All these crystal properties affect different attributes like the ease of immediately following separation operations or manufacturability during downstream processes or even bioavailability. Since there are various requirements and strict regulations to be met covering all these aspects, it is crucial to have tight control over crystallization process as well as a robust and optimum operation. In the light of this awareness and constant need in industry, many studies have been focusing on the control and optimization of crystallization processes. Recently, with the development of Industry 4.0, people started realizing the importance of model-based process design for the reasons just mentioned, and this also forms the motivation of our work. Here, you see the schematic representation of the steps we follow in the development of a digital twin for crystallization processes. The first step, or the 0th level, is to understand the crystallization dynamics and determine the mechanisms included in the process, such as nucleation, growth, type, the presence of breakage or agglomeration. Then, some experiments are designed to emphasize the existing crystallization mechanisms and to decouple them based on model training needs. Sometimes, direct design experiments are included in this step, such as direct nucleation control or supersaturation control, to explore the phase diagram limits and again to decouple crystallization mechanisms. Then, by using the experimental data and information for model development, parameter estimation is done as model training to have a predictive tool whose performance then is validated by additional experiments. If the model is accepted, after validation, it can be used as a digital twin for in silico design of experiments or process optimization, which is subjected to further validation later. Here, our aim is to demonstrate this workflow for a real-life active pharmaceutical ingredient to optimize its crystallization process. Following our methodological digital twin development framework, in the following slides, I will present the experiments designed for model training and the tools we use in our laboratory for data acquisition, which plays the key role in digital twin development and this framework. And these steps will form our 0th level. This is the laboratory setup used in the experimental part of this work. We used 3 different inline process analytical technology tools to monitor the system and for data acquisition for later steps. These are UV-Vis for concentration measurements, FPRM for crystal count and cord length measurements, also to detect events like crystal nucleation, growth, or dissolution, and particle vision for monitoring the system to detect existing mechanisms. Here on the right, you see a PVM image of compound A, which is the active ingredient used in this work during an experiment. Additionally, offline characterization tools were used for crystal size and shape determination. Here, the image on the left is the compound A crystals image from morphology microscopy. The data from UV, FBRM, and offline characterization tools were used to train the model in the parameter estimation step for specific terms of the objective function. Compound A crystallization is a cooling crystallization process. Thus, all the experiments were started with a cooling wrap to create and grow initial crystals. 6 training experiments were done with different heating and cooling rates, number of temperature cycles, and seeding conditions. These heating ramps were implemented to achieve the required minimal crystal size, and thus information of necessary temperature cycling was gained from our previous studies. We observed that heating-cooling cycles were required to obtain crystals with mean size larger than 100 micrometer by exploiting the redeposition mechanism throughout the batch. Additionally, there was no agglomeration or crystal breakage occurring during compound A crystallization. And based on our industrial requirements at hand, no unseeded experiments were to be performed. So, all the experiments were started by addition of very small primary crystals to trigger secondary nucleation and immediate crystal growth. For this reason, primary nucleation mechanism was omitted from the process model. On the left, you see the temperature profiles, which are black lines, and total crystal count from FBRM, which are orange lines, from these training experiments. Following the experiments done for model training, the next step is to make sure that the model has the right crystallization mechanisms and the correct type, and continue with the model training, also known as parameter estimation. After deciding on which crystallization mechanisms to be included in the model, a population balance model was written for compound A crystallization for both cooling and heating phases, denoted as supersaturated and undersaturated. Size-dependent growth, G, dissolution, D, and the secondary nucleation, B, were included in the model as existing crystallization mechanisms. These mechanisms have empirical power law type formulas, which you will see in the next slide, as a function of supersaturation that is created by temperature difference. Then, this model was trained for kinetic parameters estimation by minimizing the objective function shown in the middle. The difference between experimental data and simulated values for concentration and product crystal size distributions were minimized, while the correlation between FBRM counts and the simulated total crystal number was maximized. One novelty of this work comes into play at this stage. Since the model cannot simulate the crystal count as number per second, we used the simulated total crystal number by calculating the zeroth moment and maximize its correlation to experimental crystal count. This allows us to integrate a very commonly used process analytical technology tool, FBRM, in the modeling of the process and benefit from another type of data for having a predictive model. We chose this formulation because the difference between even the scale total crystal number and experimental crystal count stays very high. But the correlation between these terms provides more physical relevance due to the ability of FBRM to detect crystallization events such as nucleation, dissolution, and growth. And the number change is well reflected in the FBRM counts. For model training, 2 steps were followed to finalize the parameter estimation as listed. First, an evolutionary algorithm was used, then a refinement optimization was done by using a derivative-based tool starting from the output of the previous step. After establishing which crystallization mechanisms to be included in the balance equations, we had to decide what type of mechanisms to formulate. Laboratory experience and several simulations with the preliminary model to test the representation accuracy showed that the size dependency was present in especially crystal growth. Here you see the empirical power law type formula for growth and dissolution. These are dependent on supersaturation, which is denoted with sigma. Here the size dependency comes into play in this Kg and Kd terms. As another novelty of this work, we came up with our own size-dependent growth formula due to the broadening in product crystal size distribution measured by laser scattering technique and laboratory experience. Compared to the existing equations in literature, this new formulation, shown with equation 15, described the growth behavior of compound A the best. The hyperbolic tangent behavior describes the slow growth of the crystals under certain size, and the fast growth of the crystals with the size above that. While the second term in equation 15 provides better fit for this type of growth behavior. It basically combines two different behaviors of quasi-power law and exponential, which are common in literature and shown in this table. Nevertheless, we selected 4 of these equations. Number 3, number 5, equation 15, which we came up with, and equation 14, again, which we came up with. Here you can see that equation 15 is an extension of equation 14. These formulas are to be used in the model and estimated the kinetic parameters for each. We compare these 4 different models' performances in process representation based on the product crystal size distribution fit for validation experiments. For the solution, a simpler and common size dependency term was added since it happens much faster in every size range compared to the growth. Next step is to finalize parameter estimation and test the model accuracy. This is done by doing some validation experiments and simulating the same experiments with the model to compare the results. Parameter estimation was done for 4 different size-dependent growth rate equations, and the performance of these models were tested by comparing them to the validation experiments results. Depending on industry requirement of compound A production, our main focus was to have a predictive model which describes the final crystal size distribution the best. Accordingly, our focus was to control an optimization of crystal size distribution, and the decision to pick which model to use for optimization was based on the prediction of the final crystal size distribution of the validation experiments. Equation 14 and 15 with the hyperbolic tangent component gave the best fit, but equation 15 with the extension term was selected for the model for slightly better fit due to the broadening in the CSD. CSD as in crystal size distribution. Also, an additional decrease in the objective function value was achieved by extending equation 14 to 15 during parameter estimation, and the same trends exist in the case of validation experiments, which is a good indication that there is no overfitting. After finalizing the digital twin development, process optimization was done by using this digital twin as the last step in our framework. After deciding on the model and validating its prediction power, the model was used in process optimization. The aim was to grow crystals as much as we can, which is integrated as the maximization of D50 value in the objective function. The C term in the denominator is the span or the broadness of the crystal size distribution, which is calculated by subtracting D10 value from D90 value. These size identifiers, D50, D10, and D90, are good indicators of the broadness or the span of crystal size distribution, and they are calculated as the particle sizes where the 50th, 10th, and the 90th percentiles of the crystal number density lie. This term in the objective function means the minimization of the broadness of number density to achieve narrow crystal size distribution for uniform product. The second term is to achieve a smooth change in the temperature profile by minimizing the difference between 2 consecutive temperature points of total 10 points that define our temperature profile. 3 different scenarios with 1, 2, and 3 cycles were optimized accordingly. And the results show a significant trend. As the number of cycles increases, the range of the temperatures of cycling increases too. This also provides a better CSD, crystal size distribution, in alignment with the goal of obtaining large crystals with narrow distribution, as seen in this figure. Finally, the validation of the optimized processes was done by selecting 2 of the resulting scenarios. On the right, you see the experimental data for 1-cycle and 3-cycle experiments of the optimized profiles. The experimental difference between the product crystals, as well as the FPRM counts shown with blue, and chord length trends shown with orange, are significant. Although the model underestimated the D90 value of the crystals from 3-cycle experiments, it still led us to the best solution based on our aim and allowed us to determine key process parameters such as cycle number and temperature range. Another work in parallel was conducted on experimental design of experiments for the same compound with fixed number of cycles and batch time. The crystal size distribution features from this separate study supported the findings that were just presented, demonstrating that having the temperature cycles at higher temperatures allowed us to obtain larger crystals with narrower size distribution. It showed that once the low end of temperature cycles is not below a certain value, the most important thing to have larger crystals is also to increase the high end of the temperature cycles. A quick data analysis also showed that the correlation between the high end of the temperature cycling and the D50 and D90 values is significant, and consequently the bulk density values increased, which all affect the manufacturability during downstream processes. In conclusion, in this work, we show the systematic development of a digital twin for the crystallization process of a real-life active pharmaceutical ingredient, and used it to optimize the process based on the key quality attributes. Doing so, we introduced a new formulation for size-dependent growth to match the broadening in the crystal size distribution. Finally, we would like to emphasize the difference in the time and resources used in conducting the model-based design work and the experimental work on design space search that presented in the last slide. We strongly believe that the model-based design should be the next industrial paradigm to discover the design space and what can be done for optimum operations, minimizing the time and money spent on experimentation trials. With that, I would like to thank to my advisor, Professor Naj, and my then postdoc, Dr. Silagi, for their unending guidance and support. Also, I would like to thank to Dr. Kwan and Dr. Papayorio from Takeda for kindly supporting this project and their valuable feedback. Thank you for your attention.